There is a moment that happens somewhere between the third and fourth round. The pain has moved past the point where adrenaline covers it. The corner has run out of useful instructions. The crowd is a noise without meaning, and the only thought remaining in the mind of someone who trained for months, who flew across the country at their own expense, who cut 12 pounds in 48 hours to make weight, is whether or not they can survive the next 60 seconds. That moment, that precise human breaking point, that is what the UFC sells. Not sport, not competition, not the ancient idea of two athletes testing the limits of what a body can do. The product is the breaking point itself. In 2016, the UFC sold for $4.2 billion. The buyers were Ari Emanuel and Patrick Whitesell, to Hollywood agents who had built their careers representing other people's talent. In 2023, the enterprise value of the UFC's parent company, TKO Group Holdings, crossed $12 billion. The stock trades on the New York Stock Exchange. Institutional investors hold positions. Quarterly earnings calls happen. Analysts publish price targets. And somewhere inside all of that, in a locker room that smells like antiseptic and adrenaline, a fighter who just went 3 rounds and absorbed 89 significant strikes is being handed a check for $15,000. Before taxes, before manager fees, before the flights, the hotels, the training camp expenses they paid entirely out of pocket to be in that building on that night. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system working exactly as designed. What follows is not a story about sport. It is a story about how a cage became a financial instrument, how fighters became depreciating line items on a corporate balance sheet, and how the most profitable combat sports organization in history built its empire on a legal architecture, specifically engineered so that the people absorbing the damage would never be able to claim a proportionate share of what that damage was worth. Every major professional sports league in the United States operates under a collective bargaining agreement. NFL players, through their union, negotiated a deal that guarantees them 48.5% of league revenue. NBA players receive approximately 49% of basketball-related income. MLB players, through decades of labor organizing that included strikes, lockouts, and landmark free agency arbitration decisions stretching back to the 1970s, secured a system where the minimum salary in 2024 stood at $740,000 per year. Even in NHL hockey, historically the least financially powerful of the major American sports leagues, the collective bargaining agreement guarantees players 50% of hockey-related income. UFC fighters receive, by the most generous independent economic estimates, between 15 and 18% of the revenue they generate. The UFC does not publish fighter pay as a share of total revenue. That number does not appear in earnings calls. It does not appear in annual reports. The organization has never voluntarily disclosed it. The 15 to 18% figure comes from academic economists retained as expert witnesses, antitrust attorneys working the litigation, and a federal class action lawsuit that spent nearly a decade moving through the court system before reaching settlement. The mechanism that makes this possible is a single word that appears in every UFC fighter contract: independent contractor. UFC fighters are not employees. They have no access to company health insurance. They do not accrue pension or retirement benefits. They are not covered by workers' compensation in most jurisdictions. When a fighter tears an ACL 6 weeks before a main event, the financial consequences fall entirely on the athlete. The UFC covers medical costs for injuries that occur inside the cage on fight night. Everything before that moment and everything after it is the fighter's own financial burden. This classification was not an accident. It was a deliberate legal strategy, developed and refined over 15 years by the Zuffa organization that owned the UFC from 2001 to 2016. The independent contractor structure eliminates benefit costs. But it does something else that matters far more to the structural economics of the business. It eliminates the legal foundation for collective bargaining. Under American labor law, you cannot form a union of independent contractors. The National Labor Relations Act was written to protect employees. Independent contractors are explicitly excluded from its provisions. The UFC is not legally required to negotiate with its fighters as a group because, in the precise language of federal labor law, its fighters do not constitute a workforce. They constitute a pool of contracted talent. And talent, in the entertainment industry, has always had limited negotiating power when the entity holding the contracts also controls access to the audience. The UFC does not just control access to the octagon. By the time the system was fully constructed, it controlled access to the entire professional market. In January 2001, Dana White called his childhood friends Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta and told them the UFC was available for purchase and that he believed it was worth buying. The Fertittas were casino executives, heirs to the station Casino's empire in Las Vegas. Both had served on the Nevada State Athletic Commission. They understood regulatory systems, how industries move from fringe to mainstream, and how a market gets captured at the moment before it becomes valuable. They understood that the UFC, which had been banned from pay-per-view cable in most American states after Senator John McCain famously sent letters to all 50 governors calling it human cockfighting, was not worth buying for what it currently was. It was worth buying for what it could become. They paid $2 million. $2 million for the trademark, the tape library of recorded events, and whatever fighter contracts existed at the time. By any objective measure, it became one of the most profitable sports asset acquisitions in history, generating returns that dwarf virtually anything comparable in professional sports. What followed was a two-track campaign executed simultaneously over 15 years. Track 1 was legitimization, lobbying state athletic commissions to adopt a unified rule set, working with physicians and safety organizations to establish the sport as a regulated athletic competition, and systematically courting the mainstream sports press. Track 2 was consolidation, acquiring every competing organization and using market power to eliminate those that could not be acquired. Between 2001 and 2016, Zuffa acquired Pride Fighting Championships, the Japanese promotion considered by serious combat sports observers to be the most prestigious MMA organization in the world. It acquired World Extreme Cage Fighting and absorbed its television deal. It acquired Strikeforce, at the time the second largest American promotion, which had world-class fighters including Ronda Rousey. Daniel Cormier recalled the build's uncontract. It acquired the International Fight League and stripped its roster. Affliction Entertainment and ELITEXC were not acquired. They were eliminated. Affliction lost the broadcast partner it needed to survive when the UFC presented that partner with a better financial arrangement. ELITEXC collapsed under competitive pressure it could not sustain once the UFC began aggressively outbidding it for the fighters, generating its audience and its gate revenue. By 2016, when the Fertittas completed their sale, the UFC was not simply the dominant force in mixed martial arts. It was the entire market. No alternative employer existed with the television infrastructure, the audience scale, or the organizational depth to present a fighter with a genuine career alternative when UFC contract negotiations broke down. The contracts had been written to reflect that reality and to lock it in. A standard UFC fighter contract contains 3 mechanisms that, examined individually, might appear to be ordinary sports business practice. Examined together, they form a system of career control with no equivalent in any other major American sport. The first mechanism, athlete who competes twice annually represents 3 years of exclusive obligation. If that athlete's market value increases substantially during those 3 years, because they win, because they develop a fan base, because a competing promotion would pay significantly more for their appearances, they cannot access that external market. The appreciation in their value belongs to the UFC, not to the fighter who generated it through performance. The second mechanism is the discretionary matching right. When a UFC contract expires, the organization retains the right to match any outside offer a fighter receives from another promotion. In practice, this means that even after a contract formally ends, a fighter who succeeds in negotiating an outside offer cannot simply accept it. The UFC can replicate the financial terms and retain the fighter without having competed for their services in an open market. The fighter has performed all the work of establishing their own external value. The UFC captures that value at no competitive cost and with no obligation to have earned it. The third mechanism is the most structurally significant and the one that generated the most sustained litigation, the Champions Clause. If a UFC fighter wins a championship, their contract is automatically extended for an indefinite period at the organization's discretion until the UFC decides to release them. The duration of the extension is a system that extracted maximum economic value from fighters, while remaining within the boundaries that federal courts would permit. When fighters sued, arguing that this system constituted an illegal restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act, the case survived multiple attempts at dismissal, proceeded through years of discovery and expert testimony, and eventually reached settlement. $375 million, distributed among approximately 1,200 fighters for labor practices spanning more than a decade. The UFC generated more than that figure in a single pay-per-view event. The case was Zuffa, filed in 2014 in the United States District Court for the District of Nevada. Lead plaintiffs included Kung La, John Fitch, and Nathan Quarry, veteran fighters who argued that the UFC had illegally monopolized the market for elite MMA fighter services in violation of federal antitrust law. The legal theory was built on antitrust economics. Federal antitrust law prohibits companies from using market power to suppress competition in ways that harm workers or consumers. The plaintiffs argued that Zuffa had done exactly this through 3 interlocking methods: acquiring every major MMA promotion to eliminate alternative employers, locking fighters into exclusive contracts with restrictive exit provisions, and using its dominant market position to prevent any new competitor from reaching the scale necessary to offer elite fighters a meaningful employment alternative. The result of these 3 methods operating together was what economists call a monopsony. A monopoly means one seller controls a market. A monopsony means one buyer controls a market. When one buyer controls the labor market, workers have no competitive alternatives. When workers have no competitive alternatives, wages fall below the level a competitive market would produce. This is not a moral accusation. It is the documented mathematical behavior of single-buyer labor markets, observed across industries and across countries, regardless of whether the participants intend the outcome. The economists testifying on behalf of the plaintiffs calculated that UFC fighters were receiving compensation approximately 30% below what a competitive MMA labor market would have generated over the period in question. Applied to hundreds of fighters over a decade of suppressed earnings. That gap produced the $375 million settlement figure. The UFC settled without admitting wrongdoing. Settlements in antitrust cases do not require admission. What the settlement required was $375 million, distributed to class members, and modifications to certain contracting practices going forward. 3 years after the settlement was announced, TCO Group reported quarterly revenues exceeding $300 million in a single reporting period. The fighter compensation structure remains substantially intact. The legal architecture that generated the lawsuit exists in modified but recognizable form. The business model continues. When WMG, the talent agency holding company controlled by Ari Emanuel and Patrick Whitesell, purchased the UFC for $4.2 billion. In August 2016, they financed a significant portion of the acquisition with debt. This is standard practice in leveraged buyout transactions. The logic is that the acquired company's future cash flows service the acquisition debt, effectively allowing the buyer to use the target's own revenue to pay for the purchase over time. For the UFC, this meant that a portion of revenue generated by fighters competing in the cage went towards servicing acquisition debt rather than flowing back into operations or toward the athletes producing the underlying content. The organization that was purchased as a cash-generating machine was simultaneously required to function as a debt-servicing vehicle, with the cost of that debt carried on its books and deducted from the revenue available for any other purpose. By 2021, when Endeavor went public on the New York Stock Exchange, the UFC had become the anchor asset of a broader entertainment portfolio that included the Miss Universe organization, the professional bull riders circuit, and the talent agency businesses that represented some of Hollywood's highest-earning performers. The IPO valued Endeavor at approximately $10 billion. Analysts covering the offering identified the UFC as the primary driver of that valuation and the company's most reliable revenue-generating asset. In 2023, Endeavor merged the UFC with World Wrestling Entertainment to create TKO Group Holdings. The combined entity trades publicly on the New York Stock Exchange. Institutional investors, including Vanguard Group, BlackRock, and State Street, hold significant ownership positions as standard components of index fund portfolios. The asset that Dana White and the Fertitta brothers purchased for $2 million in 2001 now operates as a division of a publicly traded entertainment conglomerate valued in the billions. The Fighters PFL was signing credible fighters, attracting mainstream broadcast deals, and positioning itself as the employer of choice for athletes willing to take the risk of competing outside the UFC system. In 2024, the PFL merged with Bellator MMA, which Paramount Global had decided to sell. The combined organization created a genuine number 2 promotion in the sport, with a global fighter roster and recognizable names. Whether that competitive presence is sufficient to meaningfully pressure UFC fighter compensation upward remains an open empirical question. The UFC's contractual architecture was built to function under competitive conditions. Market share can be challenged without the underlying pay structure changing, particularly when the mechanisms that produce low pay are legally entrenched rather than contingent on competitive pressure. Conor McGregor, the highest-earning fighter in UFC history during his peak years, made the largest portion of his personal wealth not from fight purses, but from a boxing match against Floyd Mayweather, negotiated as a separate commercial arrangement, and from Proper No, 12 Irish Whiskey, a company he co-founded, built into a global brand, and sold to Proximo Spirits for a reported $600 million. The lesson absorbed by the broader MMA industry from the McGregor example was that genuine financial security ran outside the octagon, through brand equity and business ownership, not through the compensation structures the UFC offers its contracted athletes. Most fighters never develop the crossover celebrity to pursue that path. In 2018, the UFC signed a 5-year exclusive broadcast agreement with ESPN worth approximately $1.5 billion. The deal placed ESPN Plus at the center of the UFC's American distribution strategy and guaranteed the organization substantial annual rights fees, in addition to pay-per-view revenue generated through the platform. In 2023, that genuinely grew the sport's audience into something capable of generating pay-per-view numbers that television executives want. The question is whether a system can be simultaneously designed to maximize financial returns for shareholders and fair to the athletes who make those returns possible. The evidence from 15 years of federal litigation for annual revenue. The median disclosed fighter pay for a UFC bout in the same year was $38,000.